Eran, welcome to the show. I feel like you're one of these people that I should have spoken to on the first week after the war started, and on the I should have had a conversation with you once a month. But you're here, and I'm very excited for our conversation. I think it's a very important one. If ever there were like a natural laboratory to be doing one's research in, this is it. I mean, it's one of the most tragic and devastating times, and you live in Israel. I assume for you it's been tragic on so many levels, but as a researcher, this is like the extreme examples of what you have been studying in your profession. So just how has the last year, I always say the last year, it's been a year and 4 months, sometimes feels like it's been like all our lives. How has this year been for you, kind of both with your professional hat on, but also like personally, with the knowledge that you have about how our psychology affects the way we feel about conflict and others, other tribes or our own tribe within the conflict.
Yeah, wow. It's always been interesting here in this area for political psychologists and for people who study psychology of conflicts. But the last 16 months were like crazy for all of us, and definitely for someone who's been studying these kind of questions. I would say that I'll start on a very personal note. I would say that probably the last 16 months were it's the first time in my life in which I couldn't really distinguish the personal from the professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's very clear for me that what drove me to do this research are personal things. I was very seriously injured in Lebanon more than 25 years ago as an
In the Second
officer.
Lebanon War.
Yeah, in the Israeli army. And then in many ways the research enabled me to distance myself a little bit from the actual reality. I think that what a good researcher or a good scientist should do is to find ways to look at the reality from an external perspective. And I felt like for many years I was able to do that. And I feel like, in the last 16 months, this is simply impossible.
Please.
As a father to three kids who are living here, and knowing so many people, so many families who were hurt and during this war, and having many Palestinian friends on the other side of this terrible war, it's very, very, very difficult to differentiate the personal from the, from the professional.
I come from a journalism background, and there is this concept of objectivity when you write a news article, which never exists. We all come with our, extremely unique and specific set of histories and cultures and conditioning and temperaments and DNA. What I have found, at least for myself in the past year and a half of this war, is that I notice within myself these movements that before the war I might have been able to look from more distance. I have been as much part as everyone of these like waves that I feel sometimes dehumanizing the other side, and really identifying with my tribe, and then sometimes the shame about that. And so have you been able to kind of look at your own internal processes also as a researcher?
Definitely. It's true on so many different levels. I've never considered myself as an, neutral or objective researcher. I mean, I've always said that don't study conflicts and violence and say, let's understand this phenomenon. And I don't know, mass killing for and against, let's be neutral. I haven't been neutral about that. I mean, never. I always thought that my study or my research has a goal. The goal is, both to understand the processes, but also to offer or to try and offer solutions. And I think that one of the things that happened to me in the last 16 months is that many questions arise. Questions about, what should I ask? What exactly do we study? Are we doing the right thing? I think that there are many, many questions. I don't think that there's anyone around us that didn't ask herself or himself questions, and definitely people who study these kind of difficult research questions. I will say that also on the personal level, it's the first time in my life in which there were days in which I didn't really want to wake up and go to work. I mean, for so many years, I felt like doing something so important, something, for the future of my kids, for the future of this country and this area. But in the last 16 months, we were surrounded every minute, every second with such terrible pictures, news, whatever, that you want to go somewhere and do something different. I want to go and work on high tech, or I don't know, do something that can somehow help me to disengage myself from working with these difficult questions. But that's what I do, and that's not the right time to retire, I think.
To abandon ship, yes. Yeah. So let's go back to the research and to the data. What are the main questions that you're asking now? How do they differ from what you were asking before October 7th? And what are the kind of some of the main data points that you have discovered in the past few months, in the past year, that might be different from what people might be expecting? It's a big question. You can come at it from any angle.
Okay, so I will say, before we start talking about that, I'll say that we study both the Israeli and the Palestinian societies. But I will talk now more on the part of the Israeli society. When I don't have my Palestinian or Arab collaborators, I don't feel comfortable to talk about the Palestinian society during this war. As I think that it's better for us to focus right now on the Israeli society. There are many interesting things to say, definitely, about Palestinians. My focus would be on Israel right now. And I think that the question that I've been asking myself is, what would such dramatic collective trauma do to the mindset of Israelis, Jewish and Arab or Palestinian Israelis, when it comes to questions regarding the future of the conflict, the future of the relation with the Palestinians, different solution, emotional processes, and also what does it mean, or what are the implications of that? I mean, what can we do? I mean, are there specific interventions, ideas, messages, policies that can be relevant even for society that is definitely a society that in a state of trauma, in a state of collective trauma? And I would say that the results, we've been collecting data every week since October 7th, either in my research lab at the Hebrew University or in a Cord Center. It's the scientific arm and the applied arm of the kind of the work that we've been doing. But we have data points from every week starting from October 7th. And I would say very broadly that the picture when we look at the Israeli society is more nuanced, more complicated, and to some extent surprising compared to the what we would have expected from a society that went through such dramatic trauma.
When you say what we would have expected from a society that has gone through such a large national trauma, I assume, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you're saying that the regular expectation for a society that has been completely violated and so deeply terrorized in every possible way, you would expect a society like that to kind of close upon itself and to really no longer see the other side as in any way human, and to kind of go in the I talk a lot about the fight, flight, freeze, the kind of like we remain in that mode of like primal survival, what I call the reptilian brain of, no longer being able to access the kind of higher, more lovelier parts of our brain, which are all about compassion, to try to understand the nuance of the other, right? You would have expected that not to take place.
And everything that you've just said actually happened. But we can see the complexity in the fact that on the top of that, also other things happened that are more constructive, I would say. And these things are more surprising. I'll try to describe it briefly, and then we can talk more deeply if you want to delve into some parts of it. So I've been studying societies in conflict, like not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but conflicts around the world. Usually what you see in this kind of situation is you can think of it as a two-phase kind of process. What happens to societies that go through such dramatic collective trauma is that the first phase is exactly what you've described, usually. The first phase is radicalization, like fight-flight mode. You've described it very nicely, but basically people are saying, we have to take care of ourselves right now. We are really, and people in Israel felt like they're really under existential threat. I've been studying the Israeli society for more than 20 years. I've never seen real indications for the fact that, people are on October 10th, when we asked people if Israel would exist in a week from now, many people, more than 40%, said they're not sure. These are dramatic numbers when we think about the psychology of a society. It's one thing to say we're under threat and there are some forces outside that want to hurt us. That's one thing, versus saying I'm not sure that we will survive in a week from now. That's a dramatic like shift in the mindset.
Yeah, yeah. I talk about that as well. That 4 days after October 7th, I managed to find a flight out. I fled. I remember distinctly that feeling of really just completely primal, not being able to think clearly in any way, just being absolutely terrified for the survival of my children. And I think also what was very traumatizing were the reports from around the world of people starting to commend Hamas and the paragliders, and like those messages tapped into our most primal, probably Holocaust related evolutionary fears. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me that you saw that.
And in this context, what you usually see from society is what we actually saw from in the Israeli society is a rally around the flag, huge conservative shift. People went to the right in terms of their political views. People are basically saying, you're either with us or you're our enemy. There's no gray area. And in that sense, a huge homogeneity of the Palestinians. All Palestinians are Hamas. No innocent people in Gaza or in the West Bank. They're all our enemies. Levels of hatred and racism towards Arabs and Palestinians are, the numbers we've never seen, and it's still there. Like nothing changed in the last 16 months. And also the belief that any kind of peaceful solution to this conflict is possible is at the lowest levels that we've ever seen.
I thought you said you were going to positively surprise
no,
me.
I'll go there, but get to the more optimistic side. But just to be clear about the numbers, so if usually in the last 20-25 years, when we asked people, would you support peace based on two-state solution, something like that, we got between 50 to 60%, generally speaking. In the last 16 months, we're talking about like 25 to 28%, including Jews and Arabs within Israel. So it means that we're talking about like 10% of the Jews. These are very, very, very low numbers, the lowest numbers ever. But then when you look historically on different societies in conflict, and also on the Israeli society, when you look at past waves of violence, so the first year or two, you get this rally around the flag, extremism, radicalization, etc. But then the second phase, usually, it comes about 3 to 5 years after the trauma. On the second phase, suddenly societies pause and say, okay, but what next? Are we going to get back to the same situation as we has been here? It's before October 7th, but before this round, we need to do something different. In the conflict resolution literature, this phase is called like ripeness. Both sides in the conflict get to this feeling of mutual hurting stalemate. Like, we're hurting each other. There's nothing we can do. We need to change something. And then what we usually see is an increase in pragmatism. It's not that society has become more, they're not looking for harmony and peace. And they're simply saying we need to somehow protect ourselves and something doesn't work here. So we need to do something different. But this, again, according to the literature that I know, should have happened in October 26, 27. That's the more or less. What we saw, we've been seeing in the Israeli public in the last year is that surprisingly, like many things in Israel, we should say that, things happened much, much faster. And in many ways, these two phases happened simultaneously
Mm.
and among the same people, which is really, really interesting. So the same people that suddenly became much, much more adopted, much more negative views of Palestinians, decrease in trust, increase in hate, view of all Palestinians as one, all these very, very negative things, at the same time became much more pragmatic about solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's fascinating.
Eran, I want to make sure that I understand. When you say that these things like rally around the flag and like complete, like, we can call it dehumanization, because seeing Palestinians as a monolithic kind of population that all wants to destroy Jews, etc. When you say that's negative, is it because you have some kind of like ideological desire for Israeli society to embrace peace, or is it because you think that solutions are best reached when we are able to look at the nuance of of both of our societies, of ourselves, and of the other side?
First of all, as an immediate reaction to what happened on October 7th, I don't think that it's negative. I don't think that it's negative. I think that that's what societies do, and that's what societies should do in order for them to survive. And that's a survival mode. It's very similar to what we do as individuals when we're under real, like, existential threat. And that's what society, on the very immediate, short time frame, that's not negative at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because the threat is real and immediate. You shouldn't take risks. You shouldn't think outside of the box. You shouldn't see the complexity of the situation. You should find the best way to defend yourself, your family, and your group or your nation. And the way to do that is to create a clear line between us and them, and to bring everyone together within your group, and to mobilize people to be willing to defend their nation, their country, their group, their family. That's a great thing under specific circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when you think on a longer, like, time frame, then, and this is, by the way, that's not about the Israel. What I'm going to say right now is not specific to the Israeli society. It's much broader perspective that we have on societies in conflict. I think that one of the most tragic things for societies in conflict is that the very same mechanism that helps them to survive when the threat is immediate is the mechanism that prevent them from even exploring ways to move forward when they need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
this is true. It's not specific to the Israeli society. That's the basic mechanism that we see in all societies involved in conflict. Because
Mm-hmm.
the things that I've described right now, and we talked about positive or negative, so that are so positive, when you're really, really under existential threat, they become the reason that you cannot identify the nuances in the reality or the opportunities to move forward when the threat decreases to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in an ideal world, what we would have wanted societies to do is to be much more flexible in terms of their reactions,
Mm-hmm.
and to know how to react in this very effective fight and flight mode when you're under attack, but then to somehow move away from this fight and flight mode and look at the reality in a more nuanced way, and then try to explore ways to move forward. I think that in most cases, it's very difficult for societies to do that.
Yeah, I study less the effect that it has on societies, but I think it's kind of like the same processes that people have as individuals. I think a lot of us in the last year and a half, specifically when there were sirens and when there's news of like a terror attack, etc., it puts us immediately in that kind of like fight flight, which you say is completely normal, evolutionarily appropriate for survival. But a lot of what I talk on this podcast about is this resilience, is this kind of like flexibility, malleability of being able to say, right now I'm in my shelter. There seems to be no more threat. You know, my heart rate can decrease. I can smile to my kids. My body can kind of go from that state of threat to safety, to relative safety. And in that place of relative safety, I can generally think more creatively, right? Because that kind of what we talked about, that prefrontal cortex, you know, we can think more creatively, we can think more compassionately, we can, you know, look at the emotions of our kids. And I think what you're talking about is on a national level and on a political level, it seems that a lot of our leaders, and that's what I always say, you know, the leaders themselves don't seem to have this kind of psychological malleability of being able to say, yes, there is this threat, but the threat has decreased to this level. And now, you know, we can look at this solution, but can we also look at this solution? Yes, we need to be prepared militarily to do all these things, but we always need to keep one eye on the possibility that, you know, maybe we'll find a new partner, right? And I think what a lot of groups tend to do is just to go into that. I imagine like football fans, like, oh, it's like us versus them, and we're the good ones.
The important thing is that it also prevents us from, improving our own situation. When
Mm-hmm.
you get into this, tunnel vision kind of thinking, then let's take a very concrete example, okay? Uh, Israel as a nation, and it's not about politics. It's not about whether it's right wing or left wing. Israel as a nation has avoided the opportunity to talk about like the day after in Gaza, right? We don't have plans. We don't have strategy. We don't have any idea until Trump came last and said, okay, that's not a problem. We'll just move on. But Israel want to control our future, right? In order for you as a nation, it doesn't matter if this potential solution for the day after in Gaza would be a left-wing solution, a right-wing solution, a midway, whatever, okay? But in order for you to seriously think about the day after, you need to move away from thinking, stuck in your, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, we need to kill them all, we need to revenge on what happened on October 7th. You need to think more creatively. You need to consider different alternatives. You need to think more rationally. You cannot do that if you're in a fight-flight mode, stuck from October 7th by now. You talked about it as malleability or flexibility. That's exactly the thing. What's good or bad, what's negative or positive, it's not the same thing for all situations. I mean, right psychological reaction after October 7th is not the right psychological reaction right now. And we need to change the mindset if we want to think about our future.
So tell us about the kind of data, expected and surprising, that you have found. You said that in Israeli society, you saw this kind of acceleration of all these processes that you would normally expect to take a few years, of both, on the one hand, like entrenchment in a certain victim narrative, which is also true, and on the other hand, a kind of openness to more pragmatism, to maybe not just leaving things be, as we put the Palestinian question on the side for so many years.
Exactly. So on the one hand, we saw this radicalization, hatred, mistrust, lack of belief in peace, and that's, I always say, and people criticize me when I say that, but it's not a normative statement. It's I would say, if as a social psychologist, if I would have seen something different within the Israeli society, I would have been shocked. I mean, because that's how people respond to what happened, to these terrible events that happened on October 7th. At the same time, we see 3 or 4 other indications on a very different directions, on a more pragmatic direction, that for me were a surprise. The first one is that levels of, or the sense of urgency to resolve the conflict increased dramatically. And in order to understand that, we need to understand where the Israeli society was before October 7th. So before October 7th, many people said, there's no partner for peace, there aren't Palestinians that can be negotiated with, but also, it's not really important. There are other things that are much, much more important for the Israeli society. We've done a study before October 7th with 200 people in more than 10 focus groups. And we asked them, what are the 5 main challenges for the Israeli society in the next decade? And there wasn't even one person among these 200 people who said or mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as one of the first 5 challenges.
Wow.
So it means that Israelis basically believe that, we can live with that. Now it sounds crazy because we know where we are. But back then, it was so the sense of urgency increased from about 15%, 1.5, before October 7th, to more than 70% right now. So more than 70%, more than 2/3 of the Israelis right now are saying it's urgent to find solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the solutions need to appear now. And that's very different from the conflict management idea that was very dominant here, like before October 7th. It means that we're now in this new area of exploring different options. And the fact that 70% of the Israelis supported the Trump regional deal before these ideas of exploring like Palestinians, 70% supported this, and then 70% also supported these new ideas of offering Palestinians to live or transferring them or whatever. It means that Israelis, they want solutions. They're not willing to go back to where we were before October 7th, and that's a first and a very important step towards moving forward. The second thing that happened, and I think that many people are missing that, and that's very, very, for me, it's very important. I think that many Israelis in the last, I would say, 6 months, suddenly realize that power has limits. And that's a totally new mindset for many people within the Israeli society. I mean, the idea that military force is important, it's really important. You need to defend yourself somehow, and military force is something that can be very important in that sense. But military force has limits, and it won't provide us security in of itself if it won't be coupled with effective diplomacy, regional arrangements, a cooperation with moderate. I mean, these kind of things. That's a huge shift in people's in Israelis' mindset. Most Israelis for many, many years believed that if you only, in Hebrew we say, "Etnu letzahal lenatzach," just let the IDF win, just release the IDF, give them the time, the budget, whatever, and they will resolve all problems. I think that people now realize that the reality has changed. That when Iran attacks us, if we haven't had the support of the US and moderate Arab countries, it wouldn't be enough. And if you couple this increased sense of urgency with the understanding that military force is not enough, and with the fact that in our last poll we got more than 75% of Israelis who are saying only integration of diplomatic arrangement, including the Palestinians, and military force would provide Israel security, or would ensure that we won't get back to October 6th. That's a huge shift. So on the one hand, Israelis are not talking about peace as they talked about before, like, thinking about this very idealistic idea of peace and harmony with the Palestinians. They oppose like the two-state solution or peace solutions when they are introduced directly. But when they think about everything from a like security perspective, they're willing to be very, very pragmatic, even in making like serious concessions in order to move forward and find solutions for this conflict. And that's interesting that these two things, the radicalization on the one hand and the pragmatism on the other hand, are happening simultaneously among the same people at the same time.
What are some of the things that you think a society can do? I know you talked a lot about the education system, that you're worried that in the education system there is not enough focus on teaching tolerance and teaching kind of like seeing things from different perspectives, being open to change. And again, we can talk about the psychological reasons for that. When we make most decisions in our day-to-day lives, we don't want to have to question them all the time. You talked about when you're sitting at Starbucks or whatever there is in Starbucks here, but you don't want to ask yourself every day from the start, what kind of coffee do I like and what's good for my health, etc. So we don't like to change our opinions so much. And yet we also know that for a healthy society to function, we, and especially our leaders, need to be able to look at things anew and not be in any kind of ideology in a radical way, whether it's humanitarianism or more extreme forms of Jewish supremacy or whatever. What do you think a society can do in order to make it easier for people to look at their own ideas, which are very often very ingrained, they're cultural, so they're societal. Generally we are in communities that think the same way as us, and it's very hard for someone to be the one that says, actually, I read something and I'm changing my political views. It's extremely hard to do that. Is that necessary? And what are some of the things that you think societies can do in order to make, again, we talk about flexibility and malleability, to make it easier for people to look at evidence? And again, we live in a post-fact, post-truth world, so I'm not even sure this question is not rhetorical, but are there practical steps, whether it is in education or elsewhere, that we can do in order to have that flexibility of thought?
I think that there's the first and probably most important thing to understand before we talk about tools and solutions is that democratic societies or democratic environment or climate are not maintained naturally. And that's a very important thing like to say. And I know in a war, we're under threat, the situation is very, very difficult and very challenging. But one of the things that I've seen in my studies among many societies around the world is that the natural vector, the natural dynamic of societies, as long as there isn't any like force that stops them from going there, is to go towards these more, I would say, extremist, more people sticking to their own groups. They see all others as in a negative way. They develop these stereotypes and racist attitude. I mean, that's where societies go as long as there aren't mechanisms. And mechanisms, you mentioned education, but I can talk about other relevant mechanisms that stop them from going there. And I think that what happens in Israel in the last 2 decades is that we fail to differentiate between politics, like political views. You can be rightist or you can be leftist, versus the very basic idea of how do you create a democratic environment. An environment in which people look at each other in a tolerant, respectful way, in which people, appreciate equality between different individuals, in which people are open to new ideas, even though they don't necessarily support them ideologically. And I think that if we fail to understand that, then we're on our, very clear way, adopt non-democratic practices. And then practically what to do about that, I would say that there are two levels. One level is the normative level. And the normative level, basically, when we think about norms in social psychology, the idea is, what do people believe that others, or the mainstream of the others they appreciate, believe that is the right thing to do, or the appropriate thing to do in a certain situation. And what we see in the Israeli society in the last 2 decades is that people don't really fight for norms. Think about schools, think about the media, think about political leaders, think about the civil society. Do we put the line where we think that, what's not appropriate in the Israeli society anymore? I think that now everything is okay. I always give this example of when Rabbi Meir Kahana was first elected to the Israeli parliament. I think that it was 83 or 84. And he went into the Knesset to give his first speech. So the head of the Likud party back then, Yitzhak Shamir, former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, went out of the room and asked everyone else to join him, to get out of the room. And then he stood up in front of the media, the Israeli media, and he said, I went out because I want to say very, very clearly that people who are explicit racist are not part of this parliament. They shouldn't be here. That's not an appropriate thing and it doesn't matter if you're a rightist or a leftist. 40 years later, you can't think of anyone within the Israeli parliament, media, education system who takes care of our norms, of our social norms, of what's right and what's wrong. What do we signal to our children, to our society about right and wrong? And it's not about being, rightist or leftist. It's about basic norms. So one thing is, and I think that one of the things that at least I'm trying to do in the last decade is to convince more and more people to say, we need to set norms for the Israeli society, because otherwise you don't just stay on the same place. You don't just maintain the status quo. You simply go and become much, much, much more radical and much less democratic. And the second thing is that I think that there are specific ideas, there are specific themes that can be delivered definitely to young children, that can open their mind, even when not talking about specific political issues. You mentioned the word malleability. So many of my studies are dealing with the question of how do you make people believe that the reality, other groups, people's views are more malleable than they think. And what we show in many of our studies is that when you make people believe that people's views can change, and that groups can change, and that conflicts can change, and that reality can change, they become much more hopeful. Their levels of hatred decreases dramatically, and they're much more open to new ideas. So there are specific ideas, there are specific messages, there are specific themes that can be conveyed to people, through education or through media or through other channels of communication that can make us more open-minded.
You talk about norms, and I think it's something global. I read someone wrote recently, about Trump. What could Trump do that would make you say, he's not fit to be president? Is there such a thing today? Is there a norm by which we would say, if he did that, he would not be, he was convicted for sex offenses and financial offenses, and made, all kinds of horrible, terrible remarks about Jews as well, about women, and yet he's president. And I think it's a very, very good question, both for our politicians. And again, I'm not saying Trump is good or bad. A lot of people believe he's doing, he's a very great ally of Israel. But when you're talking about norms, you're talking about basic human values of kind of basic decency that is needed in order for not just democratic societies to flourish, but societies in which people are more tolerant, kind, trusting of each other, not to the level where it's all like butterflies and we leave our front door open, but to the point where, again, we can go back to that flexibility of being able to look at creative solutions and see that things can change. And I think it's a global trend of leaders all over the world who, by who are really breaking all norms of decent societies, of what we thought of as decent society.
I absolutely agree, but let's take Trump's example, because I think that it's a great example. You can look at Trump, let's say as an Israeli, okay? You can look at Trump and say, okay, his policies are great for Israel, okay? And you can evaluate him as a leader, as the leader of the free or democratic world, and say, he's amazing for Israel. I'm not saying if this is my position or not, it's not relevant for now, but you can say, that's my parameter for like evaluation. But you can also say at the same time, what does the fact that this specific person is the leader of the free world, what does it mean in terms of the signaling of norms? What does my 17 years old daughter understand about the world by the fact that this sexist, chauvinist man is the president of the United States? And for me, in terms of designing and maintaining norms, I mean that's a much more important parameter when I consider a leader than the question of to what extent his policies are good or bad for my group. And that's exactly what I mentioned when I talked about norms before. Sticking for your own norms, it's a fight. And you need to make compromises in order to succeed in that struggle. And I think that we fail. We fail, and that's probably our biggest failure. And again, I'm leaving the war aside for a second, but in terms of our biggest failure in terms of trying to maintain a decent democratic society.
Yeah. And I think, final thought, I think that the question really is, are the norms that most people care about, if you really ask them, is the norm, the values that they care about still tolerance, democracy, open-mindedness, humanism to an extent, you can be practical humanism, or is it some kind of like supremacist, Jewish nationalist? Because some people are saying that the trends are shifting, and that for some people, those values and those norms, the greater Israel, the biblical Israel, God and the chosen people, is kind of like a trend that cannot be ignored.
I agree. And you can ask this question from the other side. I mean, can you do both? Can you do both? Can you really? I mean, when you feel that your society or country is under threat, can you, on the one hand, do whatever is possible to defend your country, to stick to your people, to make sure that, and again, realize or acknowledge the fact that the Jewish Zionist identity of the country is very important for its survival, etc. And at the same time, maintain, humanitarian values, democracy, tolerance. I think that's probably our biggest challenge.
Eran, thank you so much. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.